Hello, welcome back to the show that just will not die, even though the lighting
The production values are pretty rough.
tries to kill it. I got this whole, we've got this white versus black contrast, honestly, because you've got, like, this really dark room, and then on my
Yeah.
side, it's just white background, and I don't think my face has ever looked paler on camera anyway, so it just kind of blends in. It's a
Yeah,
very exciting experience.
there's a light right above me that will
Washes out your
basically
face.
make my face non-existent, which I'm sure some of you would probably prefer, but you're not in luck today. Sorry.
But enough about the beauty pageant that you see before your eyes. Let's talk about the World Championship, because you may remember that we pivoted to some predictions that ended up being false. We also just in general had some predictions, but rather than specifically go group by group, we kind of want to just quickly review every team's LCS or LCS performance. You can tell what I'm thinking about. Every team's performance at the World Championship. So that, yeah, if the world teams were at LCS, that would be a fun
That
time.
would solve some of our ending issues, actually.
So I think let's start with LMS, because they kind of had the worst showing, and then work our way up. Briefly on GAM, I think their performance didn't surprise me too much. I had them over J Team, but I also think that that had a lot to do with J Team's just overall poor jungle support synergy, and I thought that that would make them much worse than they were. What were your thoughts on GAM?
I mean, I didn't expect too much from them. I am glad that I think it was only after one game, right? They put Slay in.
Yeah.
It was only after one day, yeah. So I'm glad they made that move. I think it was they landed about where I had expected them. I honestly, because I didn't have time to watch a lot of BCS, I wasn't sure how much stronger they would be than Loki. Um, and weirdly enough, I actually found Loki a bit more interesting to watch, despite the fact that they made a lot more just basic mechanical errors,
Right.
I guess. I think they had an idea of what they wanted to do, especially with very specific drafts, and they couldn't always execute it. With GAM, I didn't get that same sense of really cohesive playstyle, and I don't know if that's because of the roster changes they had to have, not even with Slay coming in, but previously in BCS. So I mean, the one game that really stands out to me from them is that one that they did win against J Team, where both teams basically were just resetting the same play over and over again. And although people crack jokes about it, that's kind of what both teams had to do to win. So it did show that in certain positions, they were really aware of their win conditions, but I didn't really see anything other than that super shocked me.
I think it wasn't that surprising. So honestly, VCS continues to be about the same. There's GAM could have been interesting because they were originally kind of conceptualized as a Vietnamese super team in a way, but I think that they went through a roster change first of all, and then also they just we're still kind of waiting, and I think there are increases in performance, but we're not quite there yet with them. So next, let's pivot to the LMS, which is slightly more interesting since this was technically their last year at the World Championship, but I think we'll still be seeing them because obviously when GPL existed, we mostly just got what would effectively be known as LMS teams. Full Taiwanese rosters. Yes, I used the forbidden word.
Yeah, we would get high-pay assassins in HQ, yeah. Pretty much.
Or, yeah, more or less. I think Flashwolf showed up. They were the Gamma Bears, right?
Yeah, they were. Yeah. Is it Gamma or Gammania Bears? And then the next year they had the LMS, and they were Yoe Flashwolves for a little bit when they went to IAM.
So there was definitely, I mean, still kind of the more consistent story, right? The same members of the gaming community there rising to the top. So that's kind of what I'm going to continue to expect. Their overall scrim pool is probably going to get worse. and their regular practice is probably going to get worse, and we'll probably see quite a few players and coaching staffs plucked from the existing LMS pool and transferred to, shockingly, the LPL. And so we'll probably also see like a worsening of competition, but I imagine we'll still get technical LMS teams at Worlds next year.
Yeah, I think it'll be a reversion, kind of, but at the very least, I'll say that since I'd say like Karsa is the first big LMS to LPL signing, like the first really big headlining one. I think since then and his success on RNG, I definitely am at least happy that there is a next level for some of these players, because it gives them, I mean, not only is it more lucrative for them, but it gives them opportunities to play against stronger teams. So I am glad that the
and become top laners
exists. Yeah, that too.
Maple the top laner. All right.
We don't really know what's going on there, but
go to LPL, become a top laner. The Dandy story. Anyway.
No.
So yeah, I was kind of pleasantly surprised by J Team, but if you really kind of deconstruct what they weren't very good. You know, if you actually just think of them in the context of other teams at Worlds that weren't twice
in Group B.
Yeah. They wouldn't have done particularly well, right? I doubt they would have won as many games in other groups. I think that they did pretty well going 1-1 with every team in this group, and it was kind of cool because they almost took the place of the Flash Wolves directly, where it was, okay, they can get out of a crappy group, you know, it's all good.
I think the thing I appreciate about J-Team, and actually the reason why I pivoted to picking them to getting out of this group, actually, because it was so close in the last video that we did, is that they seemed to prepare really well for their opponents. So they went in knowing how each of these teams was going to play, and they prepared how to play against each of these teams. And I didn't actually see the same level of preparation from a lot of teams. Now, you can debate the merit of, well, if you're a good team, and like this is a discussion that happens every year at Worlds, like, well, if you're a good team, you can prepare for yourself and how you want to play more than you prepare for your opponents. But that is one thing that I just like wanted to call out that I really appreciated from J Team. It did seem like they scouted their opponents well, and they came up with strategies to try to play against the three specific teams that they were pitted against in their group. One thing I want to bring up about the LMS overall, despite the fact that HKA and HQ both went 0-6, I actually do agree with the sentiment that Charlie put forward that I talked about in the last video, and I also wrote about it in an article, in that the overall strength of the LMS this year was actually stronger than last year's. So while I'd say that last year's Flash Wolves team was better than J Team, which is definitely the best LMS team, the best team that the LMS sent, I actually do think that even from HK and HQ, who are two teams that had like really glaring weaknesses, like in a lot of them, I do think that they were in some pretty good positions to win a few games, and they didn't look as lost in the main stage as G-Rex and Mad Team did last year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that, especially since if you look at the rosters, like you have some of these players were promising rookies last year, right? In the LMS, like Unified, for example. A lot of these players were players that you saw a lot of promise in, but that didn't really come up that didn't really have particularly good showings yet. And so the idea that this is like kind of the maturation of what were some interesting players, especially also on AHQ even, I think it's nice to see that, right? But it's also kind of disappointing that then this is the year that they're finally coming into their own, they're showing promise, and then the LMS dissolves. So it's a
Is
little bit
dying.
bittersweet. Especially since those are the types of players who are unlikely to get picked up by the LPL right away. So then you ask yourself, okay, next year they might have worse teammates. They might look even worse at the next Worlds, even if they themselves improve, right? So what are their careers? And that's like the really depressing part of this, right? Is when you think about players like Lil V and stuff like this that don't have the international reputations of your Maples and your Karses and your Fofos. I think we'll end up being in definitely a worse spot. So I think that's a little bit sad to see.
Agreed.
Anyway, so that's disappointing. Let's talk about one more region that didn't make the quarterfinals before we move on to talk about the interesting stuff. So, obviously, there's been a lot said about the LCS and the LCS approach in North America. I think that I don't want to talk a whole lot about it.
Why does North America suck, Kelsey?
For obvious reasons. I had a lot of kind of frustration with everything and everyone making their hot takes on Twitter the past whatever. And honestly, my biggest thing is that I think that it's fair to be more critical of the coaching staff and the structures within LCS than the player base. I think that there are definitely issues with solo queue and everything else, but I think that those can be compensated by having like better structure, and that's the kind of stuff that LCS can afford, right? They're kind of throwing money, I think, in the wrong direction. But in terms of like getting programs to get more interest in American and playing League of Legends in America, creating types of systems that compensate for, or just like even structural systems within the game that compensate for the fact that solo queue's over there, we're all over here. Can we create a second server that's just for Diamond 1 Plus? I know that that's like kind of a difficult undertaking because we have a smaller player base than China, but it's still something that you can maybe do at a specific time point or anything like that, right? Just like more workshopping of these ideas instead of just constantly importing players, because I think we've seen time and time again that imported players come here and they don't want to play solo queue as much, so it's not like they're improving the quality of solo queue or the player base or anything like that. That I saw was like I wrote this really, really long article that I might end up just tweeting because I'm kind of over talking about the same stuff over and over again. My only major opinion change, I think, from that was that I don't think in-houses are ideal. I think that in-houses will end up creating a system that hurts rookie players more because it's harder for them to get invited into those systems. So while it might make LCS competition better, it will not be good for the central problems and will increase what I think is the biggest issue, which is like the gap between mature LCS players and fully developed LCS players, and then, you know, the next generation that should be coming up right now and kind of isn't. So I think that that's a huge thing. And like stuff like there was a tweet actually that LS made that I really agree with, which is just that stuff like how you should be playing your wave is more stuff that we're just like completely behind on. And then of course everyone has made the side lanes point, but that's still obviously not fixed, right? So there's something definitely wrong within how the game is played and how the game is like taught within LCS in North America, and hopefully I can be part of finding a solution. Obviously I'm an academy coach, but definitely I can be part of that solution. So instead of talking a lot about it, I personally don't want to. I would just rather work on the solution, right? So what kind of is your perspective though, Emily?
I mean, I think it's a multifaceted issue. One of my personal favorite events of the year is actually scouting grounds, and I don't think I've made a major secret of this. I think I've tweeted about it several times to the point where Riot even knows that is my favorite event to go to. And the reason for that is because you really get to see, and this is, again, remember, this is a really short amount of time. It's not anything near what like an LCS day would be, right? Because part of the experience is just coming and experiencing what it means to be a part of the LCS, which also means stuff like makeup and features and like all this other, things that I just think players probably don't think about, that's like part of the job. But that's the idea of scouting grounds, is not only to scout the talent, but also to give them that experience. And the reason why I'm prefacing this with that is because I just want to make or reiterate the point that it's a small amount of time that coaches get to spend with these players, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like you have a massive coaching staff. It's usually just like 2 to 3 people that are working with the players. Maybe if you have an LCS player or a coach that is, a top laner, former top laner, they'll work with the top laner, etc. But it's not like a specifically individualized coaching. It's not as in depth as you could get even in like one scrim review with like an actual team. And I know this is a long lead in, but I promise I'm going somewhere. The transformation that some of these players go through and the stuff that they can learn in that short amount of time is actually super impressive. Like, I did not expect players to pick up as much as they did the first year I attended. I think it's always really impressive to watch. And it tells me that, yes, it would be significantly a larger amount of work due to the amount of challenges that NA does face that a coach or a member of staff couldn't fix, right? But I do think that there is effort that can be put in with these players, especially at like an amateur level. A weird meandering path from amateur tournaments to whatever they want collegiate to be, to academy, to LCS.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of times people won't even know that like amateur tournaments are happening, or that they exist, or that amateur teams exist. And like, all these players come in and they know, because they know each other and they're like on each other's amateur teams and they see each other in solo queue or whatever. But like, that is where the level of scouting, in my opinion, is like at the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like, it's frustrating because when you face a problem like this that's so multifaceted, that has so many issues, it's hard to say something on it and then not have a solution. Because I'll be upfront, I don't have like this magic fix in terms of what's going to save NA, but that is a major crack that I see in terms of like talent development. And yes, it's going to take a lot more, because a lot of the stuff that an EU player or a Chinese player or a South Korean player would learn just playing on their ladder, players are not going to learn in North America. They're not going to learn it on the North American solo queue ladder. So it's an arduous task. It's going to take a lot of work from a lot of different people, and putting resources into the proper channels. I compared it in an article I wrote, which was like really just a reaction piece, not in any way to be taken as this is what's wrong with NA and here's how we fix it. But I wrote about the LPL's like famous meeting at Rift Rivals with like all of the coaches at like 2 a.m. under like a street light, and they're saying they're smoking, and they're just like, how do we actually win this tournament? Let's work together. And like, which sounds really dumb, right? But I don't even know, even after this World Championship, if North America's had that epiphany yet. Like, if orgs at the top, if everyone is willing to work together to fix it. And maybe that's also depressing. We just got through a depressing segment with the LMS, but I would like to see something like that. I would actually like to see people who have power and who can do more than me to fix something like this, to actually be meeting with each other, to discussing like actual genuine solutions, because it's not something that one org can fix. It's not something that a team can fix by throwing money at players. Again, it's like multifaceted. There's so much here. And I can feel Reddit yelling at me now, so I'll just cut it off there. But like, that's kind of my opinion. Like, I have a lot of like half-informed opinions, and I wanted to bring that scouting grounds example up because I really do think it's so impressive how much an amateur player can learn in a weekend. And if they can learn that in a weekend, then they can learn a lot more in a better environment with better infrastructure.
Hooray! Anyway, LCS sucked. I do think that what to talk about in terms of it, we're just breaking down the teams and their performances. So I had an epiphany at this Worlds that I feel like I should have had years ago, which is that the reason why LCS teams suck in the second week and are good in the first week is because the first week everyone comes and they're like, I don't know, it's so weird because everyone is so aggressive in scrims, and we get on stage and everyone just plays really slow, and it's like, what region is really good at playing slow and are playing for scaling and team fighting and then just like brawling it out when people are making mistakes and fucking up? I know the region that does that all year and doesn't have to be nervous for that to be the standard state of play. LCS. So you're always going to get your first game wins in the first week of LCS Worlds for the LCS teams, because the second week everyone realizes, you know what, the stage isn't that scary. We've kind of got a better grasp on the meta. We feel more confident. We're not drafting 0 damage comps with Kale and Morgana blitz bot lanes anymore because we realize those don't work. And now we're actually playing champions. We're playing a little bit faster. Our coordination is better. We've kind of broken out of our funk. We realize it can't get worse than going 0-3 because, you know, Fnatic did that in 2017, and that's still the worst week 1 group stage record with a team emerging from groups. So there's still light at the end of the tunnel. We just gotta shake it off, turn it around, and then they start playing things like what Griffin showed us in the second week with the more aggressive kind of Lee Sin jungles, Elise jungles, things like that, and then LCS doesn't react, right? I also think LCS has the highest blue side win rate. And that's because a lot of LCS teams just sort of draft in isolation, and they're like, we can visualize the comp. But since LCS teams and LCS players frankly don't focus as much on laning as, say, LEC, which I think is the region that focuses the most on laning, most likely, is those types of teams are not going to be in a position where they ever get challenged for just drafting like their comp in isolation and not responding to the picks on the right side of the screen. So you get your first pick, the champion that you want, and then you fill out your composition like this. And then the other side is like picking lane counters to that, and you think, okay, it doesn't matter because I'm not going to get challenged in lane, and so eventually I'll just have the better composition and I'll win like that. But that doesn't work when people actually play counter picks effectively in lane and manage to muscle you out. So I think that's a big factor in why LCS teams are losing. TL in particular was an interesting case for me. What were your thoughts on some of the things TL was doing in week 2?
General flaw or like something that people should keep in mind if they're looking at like a prediction or anything from me is I always go with the more consistent team, and so I did not believe in IG actually going into the second round robin, and they put Ning back in and they proved me wrong. But I think the most, let's just say, like, interesting look I guess we got from TL was that first game against Damwon where they were going to play a Anivia mid and Asai on top.
That was, the first game of week 2, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was the second because IG beat HQ before that. Oh wait, yeah. Okay.
The first game of TL for weeks.
Yeah, TL's first game. So what they were, I mean, I did like picking away the Kai'Sa, because in case you don't know, one of Nuclear's strongest champions, and getting him off of that, decreases his ability to affect what Damwon are doing. So that was one part of the draft that I did like. They picked the LPL special, which is the Kai'Sa Nautilus. I just didn't understand this composition going up against Damwon specifically. And I also think that Damwon had a pretty good response to it. And I was in that, like, they knew that TL wasn't going to challenge them early, I think. And so they were just like, okay, we'll go with Kale. We have Corgi for like holding mid wave and the Yasuo Gragas bot. I mean, I think Damwon pretty much just called TL's bluff in this entire draft. And we're just like, okay, like, if you want to do that, then we trust that we are stronger late regardless. And I think that's another, like, it's not like unseen, but with TL specifically, the style that they end up defaulting to, I think, piggybacking off what you said, if a team does call their bluff and it's just like, we're going to go late with you, and we're going to still end up like winning this game. I think that TL's late game is also not the strongest, despite the fact that that's what they typically rely on in LCS. So it's not only a matter of the fact that they're not adjusting as well, or they're not adapting to something that would be a bit more surprising or a bit more like early game skirmish heavy, but they're also going up against teams that are going to be better at them at what they want to do. And for me, that's what this draft was.
Yep. I think the thing is that Anivia is actually pretty good because there's not a lot of long range in Damon's picks. Comp. So you see the Yasuo, and the Anivia pick actually makes sense. But like you said, it was just a lot of mistakes in the laning phase. So then their composition actually doesn't scale that well, except for the Anivia, really. Everything else basically outscales. So I think, and then you have the Kale Rek'Sai combinations, so kind of less mobile picks like the Anivia aren't super safe. There's a lot of stuff going on for Damon's composition in general, so I think that they just kind of got outdrafted, even though their idea to counter the Yasuo wasn't terrible. I like having the Swan and Anivia in a game with the Yasuo in it. It's not too bad. But yeah, it was just kind of an unfortunate overall situation. I also think that Jensen's pool felt a little bit weird. So you have a lot of champions that it feels like he's not bringing out that he would normally bring out, like the Rise. Just Syndra not being picked. And you get a lot of LeBlanc. And LeBlanc seemed like the pick he was defaulting to because that was the one that they'd won their games with, right? They'd won against Damwon, they'd won against AHQ with the LeBlanc, right? And then he comes out with the LeBlanc in the last game, and they have a very kind of early focused draft, and I was kind of joking that, you know, Ning was gonna make that easy for them because Ning is very coin flip as a player. And it's like, oh, he's just gonna pick fights when they technically have 3 losing lanes and a losing jungle matchup. He's just gonna pick fights for some reason, and then I don't know, within the first couple minutes of the game you had Ning actually counter ganking correctly and Jensen getting solo killed, and it immediately felt really difficult for them to win. So that was unfortunate. They also just misplayed their matchups pretty definitively if you actually watch that game from a very early point. So I don't know. They're also not executing. Like, maybe they're aware of how the meta can be and they're not executing it well, but it feels kind of sad to watch for sure.
Yeah. Like, it's that final game was really, as soon as Rookie got that solo kill, he was basically a second jungler.
That's how you play Kiana with the Moby Boots.
Yep.
Woo!
But yeah, I mean, I I know a lot of people were like arguing like what if TL were in a different group? Would they have gotten out of Group B, for example, which is the group that everyone loves to like put teams in to try to compare. I'm not sure what team you're taking out, but based on what we saw from TL in their last round robin, and based on what we saw from Splice in their last round robin, I still think that Splice probably would have beaten out TL. So even that comparison is a bit faulty. I think for me, like, NA teams have this reputation for not adapting and not adjusting to the meta as well as other regions. And I think that part of that comes from, again, of what you were saying in terms of scrims to stage, but then also when you have so many other deficiencies in macro, adjusting on top of that is more difficult. So
yeah, I think
that's another thing to consider.
I think for sure, like a lot of North American teams live in a bubble of their meta, which is you can all group mid, and if we all group mid, then we can catch out the enemy midsection because the enemy midsection will be overextending, right? So there's generally this attitude that we can't 1-4 in America that I think stems a lot from solo queue, or 1-4 and 1-3-1 in America that I think stems a lot from solo queue because our midsection will just get caught. But there are ways to play that midsection so that you don't get caught, right? So, and I think a lot of people are aware of that, which means that when they're constantly grouping, then the enemy team doesn't open up their midsection to get caught, and then their side lanes are getting XP advantages. Yeah. And so they're also stronger when the team fight comes because their front line and their assassin carry or whatever is stronger and can just one shot the AD carry. So you can't even front to back team fight them. I think that that's a pretty significant factor. For sure, and it's something that we've been talking about a lot. I also think the way that they were playing their jungle meta at MSI was really questionable, so that was like really exciting because they were, when you're so behind in all, the point is kind of that when you're so behind in all of these sort of understandings of actually how to play the game, you have to adjust to that plus adjust to whatever the meta is, right? Or if you have it wrong or incorrect, or if it changes in the break between week 1 and week 2. You have to react to too many things. And so the fact that the internal NA meta, or to win in NA, all you have to do is this, is a certain way, ends up being really problematic at international competition. And that's why I think what Smithy did was so impressive at MSI, which was kind of adjusting to the jungle meta, or how he had to play differently as a jungler, on top of the way that they needed to play for the tournament. So I think that was really cool, and that's another reason why I'll defend Smithy, even though he has a lot of haters. So almost all of the junglers coming from an A at this tournament had really bad showings. So I think Sven Skaren showed up, and last week it was like, here, Smithy, I'm gonna do you a solid. You're off the hook.
Oh no!
Let's go, brother. But yeah, it was a sad tournament for North America, but not too unexpected. I think a lot of people had higher hopes after MSI, but I do think it was, I do think we should be aware that the problems all still exist. It's not like we just magically fixed them this year because TL managed to buy another import. So yeah, it's just the way it is.
I mean, alternatively, the other thing I would say is that it doesn't mean that North America can't. Like, it also doesn't mean that it's impossible. And, like, to go back to what I was saying just about the region in general, it just means it's going to be more work.
Yeah.
Like, that is, like, it. So that's, I'm glad you brought up MSI because I think this World's performance has kind of already erased it in people's minds, similar to how
2015.
Yes, 2015 China. Come on now, a scar that is still on both of our hearts, probably. Where EDG's win at MSI is like completely forgotten because of the Chinese team's performances in the group stages and in the quarterfinals of Worlds. So, better luck next time, North America.
So
RIP.
Yeah, let's briefly just address what happened in Group C, which
Oh, RNG,
I
why?
mean, it was the most RNG thing possible, and it was the most Fnatic thing possible. So
Yeah.
I
The
think,
last RNG composition was interesting.
I
I
think
will.
the storyline in and of itself is speaks for itself, right? Because these teams have a really long history. If you look at the historical head-to-head at Worlds between Europe and China, it's actually Europe favored if you remove RNG versus Fnatic, which is where whereas where China has gotten most of their wins versus European teams. So, yeah, it's a very interesting one. But anyway, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, after like there's a world where RNG beat SKT and this group goes completely differently. I'm
Oh
still
yeah.
frustrated that all three of these teams didn't make it out because similarly, so like there's this weird like in moment adjustment where like now RNG always sucked and et cetera, et cetera. Whereas week one, everyone was like, well, of course Fnatic suck. Like they look terrible in playoffs, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, et cetera. I think there's a little bit of revisionist history when it comes to these two teams in terms of the way people viewed Fnatic's week one performance and then the way people view RNG's week two performance. And I think the main thing that I actually want to reiterate is that I think all three of these teams, Fnatic, RNG, and SKT, are all very strong teams still within the context of this world championship. So it is really heartbreaking for me that RNG did not make it out of this group despite some of their, especially in their final game, their drafting, what they ended up falling back on as a team. And also, I think it's really sad that Xiaohu specifically did
Yeah.
not seem to have a particularly good tournament. And that is
Well, good week two
always,
in particular, right? Because I actually
yeah,
thought he was fine in the
yeah,
first week.
his week one was fine. Sorry. Speaking of revisionist
Mm-hmm.
history, wow. His week two it was rough, and so whenever that happens with Xiaohu, RNG is going to suffer because he's such an important part of this team. Um, Despite the fact that everyone is always going to be like, "Oh, ZI,"
I mean,
you know.
there's a lot of map mispositioning that UZI needs to do in order to get the CS per minute numbers that he does. He needs to be farming camps at a time when you should be contesting mid wave control, right? Stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. Not to excuse, I don't know. Ming decided to defect in the first game that they played versus SKT because that game should have just been won.
Yeah, I
Gosh,
don't know
but
about
but
that.
the thing, of course, is that if RNG had better macro, they wouldn't be in positions where there are five on mid turret and Ming is just going in randomly. So there wouldn't be in positions for those types of mistakes to be made if they had like actually good macro and map control. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's also something worth discussing. Is that I said really objectively at the start of this that I thought RNG would get out because they had a good stylistic matchup against SKT and even FNC, and I think that was illustrated pretty well until the final game where their insistence on playing through bot lane versus Zaya Pike as Ezreal. Like there are so many reasons why this is. I have to discuss this bot lane matchup because it is such a gigantic fucking travesty. Okay, so
Both of the bot lane matchups are just like how after RNG Fnatic game one, Uzi I was like, yeah, like we don't know what that bot lane was. Like we're not sure. Like we didn't know what to do.
mhm.
Because it was so confusing to them. Like I feel like Fnatic must have been that way with this bot lane matchup.
No, but at least Morgana Blitz like has something. Okay, so blue side, right? Let's start with this. Blue side, it's really easy to play survive side ball in on blue side if you need to, right? Because it's much more
Mm-hmm.
difficult to dive blue, you have the gigantic dragon pit to get over, plus like the Krugs wall, which you need blast cones to go over. Plus, you can just control that area of vision really easily through mid jungle, like just that choke by the Wraith camp. You guys probably know what I'm talking about. Whatever, like you would have to control that area in order to be able to dive the bot side. Whereas to dive bot from blue as blue team, if you want to dive the red bot lane, you just have to control the river basically. So that's like kind of much more easy to do. On top of being able to have the straight through path just through their blue buff area, etc. So you have all these factors going on, which means that if you have like a blue side pike gets poked and he just kind of sits under tower, isn't really under threat of dive or anything like that, and regens health. Blue side pike is like incredibly safe. Okay, so you're running poke versus blue side pike. All right, Ezreal Lulu is a poke lane versus blue side pike. What are you feasibly going to do there? And then if pike ever gets on top of you, right, with a dive setup or whatever, then I don't know what Lulu ult is going to do what exactly. That's what I thought. Okay, so I just I had to express how frustrating it was to see that. On top of watching them ban, I don't know, what did they even ban? They banned Leona. Congrats, guys. That was some big brain plays right there. Good job. You banned Leona, a champion that Hillsong is obviously notorious for inting on. Okay. No, actually, Leona hasn't been that bad this year, but his pike is definitely his pick, right? So it was just really strange to me that they ended up basically pinching Ming's pool to and still giving Hillsong the champion he wanted to play. Yeah. Anyway, I had to get that off my chest, but beyond that, it really does illustrate how important draft has been at this tournament, because I do think a lot of these teams are just really close in level. And
yeah,
that comes through a lot. Aside from RNG's macro being bad, I think that their players are pretty good. UZI has a lot of map mispositioning in order to get the CS leads he does. He denies his teammates a lot in order to get the CS leads he does, and that doesn't excuse Shahu suddenly not knowing how to play Kale or anything, but it does suck. Because it means no matter how Shahu is playing, you still only have the one win condition. So I think RNG definitely deserved to get to be stuck in this group, if any of the teams did, even given what Fnatic didn't do, because I do think Fnatic is just objectively the better team. So that's the way it is.
RIP RNG. I will say one of the things I think that we brought up in our previous video and even in our first video, because we both watch LPL, but all three LPL teams have really specific ways that they like to play.
Oh yeah.
And within those parameters, they can be like the best team in the world. But outside of those parameters, or when those are pushed, that's when they start having issues, because they'll just try to take whatever they can do and squeeze it within those parameters. And I do think we saw that with RNG, especially in their final draft against Fnatic.
And you can argue that there are like similarities then between LPL teams and LCS teams, and so then you can bring up talent arguments. But I also think that, for example, the bot laning of RNG is so advanced compared to a lot of LCS bot lanes that you're missing a lot of game knowledge in those types of areas. Teamfight execution, those types of things as well. So I think that that's one of the differences that you can make, because you can also argue that LCS teams only know how to play one way, but the way in which they perfect their one way doesn't quite get to the LPL level because of laning knowledge gaps or other factors than just macro. Because I actually think in some ways the LCS macro is better. Like, Fiora wouldn't group in that C9 game because Fiora would never have been inside lane to begin with if that was RNG. Anyway, fun times. So, yeah, that's a pour one out for RNG. I know that a lot of people are sad that 3 teams didn't make it out, but I do think that if that's the group, then RNG is just objectively worse. And I'm glad that if only 2 of those teams could advance, then it was Fnatic and SKT, because it makes the rest of the tournament more interesting. And I will use that to segue into our bracket stage. So it's going to be the end of part 1. That'll be the cut. Hooray. So next time we'll be talking about, when I release the second part in a few hours, we'll just be talking about the bracket predictions.